Russia's army is pressing its attack on Kyiv and other major Ukrainian cities, shelling targets that include residential buildings and other institutions sheltering civilians. To some, the tactics look familiar, like a page from Russia's playbook in Syria. Indiscriminate bombardment of heavily populated centers, cluster munitions, and sieges all add up to a dirty war inflicting widespread suffering. Reports suggest battle-hardened Chechen and Syrian fighters are in fact joining the Russian forces fighting in Ukraine. On To the Point, we ask, war in Ukraine, does Putin want total devastation? Hello and welcome to the Point. It's a pleasure to welcome our guests. Liana Fix is a security and Russian expert who works with the Berlin-based Kerber Foundation. It's great to have Kristen Helberg with us once again on the show. She's a freelance journalist who has reported extensively from the Middle East and Syria for German and Swiss media. And joining us from Bonn, Louis Sanders from DW's investigative unit. So let me ask all of you to tell us a little bit about how you interpret what we're seeing at the moment on the ground. And Liana, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol, all under heavy attack. What are you hearing about the extent of civilian and military casualties on both sides?
Well, Moscow's initial campaign was very much the idea to have a shock and awe campaign and to finish the war quickly, have a victory parade in Kyiv, and that was it. This has not worked out, and we see casualties on the Russian side which amount to hundreds and thousands of casualties unexpected by Moscow. So this is now a shift in strategy. Russia could not achieve its initial aims, taking Kyiv, regime change, and now it's going for the part that we've seen in Syria, to terror against the civilian population, to force Kyiv to make concessions in negotiations, because the pictures and the way of warfare is just so brutal and cruel at the moment.
Let me ask you about those negotiations, because we're seeing or hearing conflicting signals. On the one hand, we have the Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Lavrov, saying that he's optimistic that the talks are making progress. On the other hand, we have President Putin saying he's going to prosecute this war to the end. What do you make of that discrepancy?
It's an incredibly difficult situation for the Ukrainian government to be in, because obviously they want to end the death and the terror that is taking place in their country. But Moscow has demonstrated in the past that you have to look at what Moscow does and not what it says. So while in rhetoric they have toned down their demands, there's still very much the possibility that in actual negotiations Moscow will violate agreements, will continue to attack civilian and military targets, and will also do that to force Ukraine to further concessions. It's a catch-22 situation for the Ukrainian government and for Zelensky at the moment.
Let me ask Louis to talk a little bit about what Russia is doing. Attacks on civilian buildings, residential centers, cluster munitions, and summary execution of combatants. Are those simply the normal tactics in a nasty conflict, or something worse? President Biden in the U.S. has called President Putin a war criminal.
Well, they're definitely not the norm, especially under the rules of war. And I think what we are seeing right now is Russia is taking action in a way that they're going into areas, attacking places indiscriminately. And I think the most noticeable way that we could see this is just attacks on hospitals. So the WHO has come out and said, we've seen more than 50 cases of hospitals being attacked. And so I think this is a good indicator, especially because hospitals are protected objects under the Geneva Conventions and just generally speaking, international humanitarian law. So when we look at what the situation is and we look at what Russia has done, for example, in Syria, I think we could very much see that there's just there's not a lot of discrimination between combatants and civilians at the moment.
Thank you very much, and we will come back to the topic of war crimes a little bit later. But, Kristen, let me take us back to what we heard from Liana in regard to the fact that that shock and awe concept certainly hasn't played out. Now, you've said elsewhere that Putin tends not to overreach, that that's a pattern you observed in Syria. But, in fact, hasn't he overreached? This military campaign clearly isn't going as he thought it would. Clearly, Russia's military is not as adept as many people believe them to be.
Yes, definitely. I mean, he didn't overreach in Syria because the Syria intervention was unpopular in Russia. It was far away. People were not so much into saving President Bashar al-Assad, back in Russia. So what he did there was a very limited engagement from his point of view. He would send military advisors. He would send his air force, which was very effective, some naval troops. But obviously, in Ukraine, it's not going the way that he wished for. So he faces a lot of resistance. He was not counting, was not expecting this. But he knows exactly how to break resistance from Syria, how to break the resistance, especially of civilian population. And this is exactly what we are seeing now in Mariupol. If you want to take control of an area, you seal it off and you bomb it from the air, on the ground. You bomb civilian infrastructure, hospitals, the theater in Mariupol, we have just seen this. Then you cut off electricity.
A theater that was sheltering many civilians, apparently.
Hundreds.
But do we have confirmation that, in fact, that was targeted?
We don't know yet, but it's said that it has been targeted and that even there was some alert putting, you said this before, the name of children in Russian on the ground to make sure that it was not attacked. The same happened in Syria. The coordinates of hospitals were given to the UN to make sure that they were not attacked, and they were deliberately bombed by the Russian Air Force. So what I wanted to say is, you besiege an area, you cut it off from water, from electricity, from the internet. People would stay incommunicado with the rest of the world. And this is all to make them agree in the end to their own expulsion, to displace the people through these so-called humanitarian corridors. And in the end, this is a form of ethnic cleansing, really, because you make the people leave the area. It's easier to control Mariupol afterwards if half of the population is already gone. So this is the same playbook, exactly.
Then let's take a closer look at the long and destructive Russian intervention in Syria and whether, in fact, it does hold lessons for the war in Ukraine.
Images from 2016. Eyewitnesses reporting a Russian air raid on a suburb of Aleppo. By then, Russia had been bombing targets in Syria alongside the Assad regime for months. The so-called fight against terrorism killed thousands of civilians. Hospitals, schools, and markets were targeted. Incendiary vacuum and cluster bombs, all banned worldwide, were also used. Putin's air force shifted the Syrian war in Assad's favor. But the Russian president did not send in ground troops. He left the street battles up to Assad loyalist fighters. Ukrainian President Zelensky is now warning of their intervention in his country. Thugs from Syria, from the country that was destroyed in the same way that the invaders are destroying us now. Is Ukraine facing a scenario like the Syrian war?
And let me put that question to Louis and also ask whether you think that we are seeing a change in Russian tactics, for instance, with this intensifying aerial bombardment, and what the lessons from Syria do, in fact, tell us about where this may be heading.
Well, indeed, if we look at the tempo of the invasion, right, within the first couple of days, I mean, I don't think the Russian armed forces were expecting the kind of resistance that they were met with by Ukrainian forces. And so what we're seeing now is this escalation towards just bombing areas, bombing civilian cities, urban centers, where there's a high risk of high civilian casualties. We've already started seeing this with regards especially to hospitals. And I think what's interesting in this regard is that we can begin to see the kind of tactics that the Russian armed forces were using in Syria. Now, for example, I think a good point that was raised earlier was, are these intentional attacks? Are these deliberate attacks? And I think there's a few parameters or indicators that we can look at to see if that's the case. Now, I think for example, in hospitals, you could see what is the location, what's their proximity to military sites or legitimate military targets. We can also see if an attack was conducted twice. So for example, there's a lot of work that's been done on the legal ramifications of double tap attacks. So for example, if an airstrike hits a place and then a couple minutes or a couple hours later, it's hit again, that oftentimes is a good indicator, especially for war crimes prosecutors, to say that there's intent here. And so what we're starting to see is this pattern emerge where there are very solid indicators that there are deliberate attacks on these civilian objects, which are protected under international humanitarian law.
Liana, some experts draw analogies not only to Syria, but also to the conflict in Chechnya.
Absolutely. I mean, just the pictures in Chechnya were very similar. The indiscriminate bombing campaigns and really the change of tactic from finding any political solution to finding a solution in the ground by sheer terror and bombing. So this is a pattern that we've seen in Russian foreign policy in the past, but no one would have expected that this would apply to Russia's brother nation immediately in its neighborhood. And this is what makes it so difficult to stomach that this is taking place in the middle of Europe, while at the same time the West has only limited means to stop Vladimir Putin because there's concern about an escalation to World War III in case a no-fly zone or other direct NATO military intervention takes place, as we've seen in the past in Libya, for instance.
I want to come to the question of escalation. Let me go back to Kristen and what you observed in Syria. You have said elsewhere that you concluded, on the basis of the Syrian conflict, that Putin is not a strategist but a tactician. Can you tell us what that means in terms of the war in Ukraine and where this could be heading in escalation?
Well, in Syria, he proved to be very flexible in his reactions towards the very complex dynamic of the war in Syria. For example, whenever he saw a lack of action from Western countries, he would immediately step in and take the chance and make it work for himself. We had, for example, the famous red light by ex-President Obama in 2013 when the Syrian regime attacked with chemical weapons the outskirts of Damascus, and he didn't want to send any troops or attack back then. So Putin made it easy for Obama not to do anything because he said, OK, we will talk to Bashar al-Assad and we will make him give up his chemical weapons program. So he would, in the end, he would promote himself as the big diplomatic leader.
Here he doesn't have a proxy. It's Russian forces
It's Russian. That's the biggest difference. And we have to explain this maybe a little bit because his intervention in Syria is not against the international law because Assad himself invited him to come for help. So what is illegal is the way of the kind of warfare that we see there. But maybe because I think there's one very important lesson that he learned from his Syrian experience. And this is important when you talk about escalation. Putin knew of, or he understood from his Syrian experience that whatever he does on the ground, be it targeting civilian infrastructure, be it indiscriminate shelling of residential areas, he will get away with it as long as no NATO territory is involved. So he can do whatever he wants, even in Ukraine. This is what he feels like, without being confronted with any military reaction. So the fact that the international community did not stop the attack on civilians in Syria, it didn't even sanction it by the means that we are seeing now, led to this fact that he feels encouraged, or he felt encouraged in the first place, to go to Ukraine, to attack Ukraine and to follow the same playbook now.
Let me pick up on that, but do it with a slight detour, namely to talk about foreign fighters and the potential that their presence could lead to escalation. And Liana, in fact, foreign fighters are entering this conflict on both sides. We've heard Vladimir Putin essentially inviting them directly, and also people like the Chechen leader, Mr. Ramzan Kadyrov, saying that, in fact, he is in Ukraine. I don't know if we have proof of that or not. But how do you see this impacting the war?
As you said, we have foreign fighters on both sides. So the Ukrainian military created an international legion where internationals who want to support Ukraine in the war can join. In response, the Russian president, and I think there are two dimensions to this. First, he wanted to demonstrate that Russia has also international support and has also foreign fighters who support Russia's cause and therefore want to join the war. But on the other hand, he also invited foreign fighters to improve the war effort because it was not going well, it is not going well, and the use of conscripts in Russia is something which is a very difficult issue because there are these soldiers, mothers in Russia who ask why are their sons not coming back from their conscription. So this is a tactic both sort of on the military side, but also in the narrative side to argue Russia is not alone against the world fighting this war. It has international support, and its cause is a just cause, which is obviously not what almost the rest of the world believes.
Louis, let's talk about the Ukraine side. In fact, we are seeing Europeans going into Ukraine to join the conflict on the Ukraine side. Germany has warned its citizens not to go there. What do we know about how many European fighters are there, and could their presence provide Putin with an excuse to say that essentially NATO is intervening in this conflict?
Well, to answer the first part of the question, the estimates right now, I think, provided by the Ukrainian government, but also kind of estimates that we've heard also at the border, is anywhere between 16 to 20,000. But that's a hard number to corroborate with regards to how many foreign fighters are coming into Ukraine and wanting to fight on the Ukrainian side against Russian armed forces. Now, could this be used from the Russian side as a sort of how do we say, as a justification to continue the war or to escalate the situation further? I think they would be hard pressed to actually be able to justify that in terms of legally sound options that they could have for kind of pushing forward with that. I mean, there's just nothing to say that as long as we don't see actual NATO forces going in or member states taking kind of unilateral action, I think it would be hard for Putin to justify anything that would come close to an attack on NATO territory. So.
Kristen, do respond to that if you like, but let me kind of up the ante a little bit in terms of potential scenarios. If Russia sees increasing economic distress and rising protests at home, and there are reasons to believe that he will see both, if Russian forces remain bogged down in Ukraine, and we see a continuing flow of weapons from Western countries to the Ukrainian side, would you expect Vladimir Putin at some point to resort, for example, to chemical weapons, as did his proxy, Mr. Assad?
I think Putin knows exactly that the red line lies outside Ukraine. Whatever he does inside Ukraine would not provoke any kind of NATO involvement on the ground, I guess. What we see already is this kind of propaganda, which is very important. And I see a big parallel here, because the propaganda in Syria, you always have to delegitimize your enemy, obviously, to explain your own strategies and your warfare. So in Syria, it was always this fight against the terrorists. Now in Ukraine, it's the fight against neo-Nazis and nationalists. So this is very similar. Concerning chemical weapons, what happened in Syria is that Russia would announce that they fear of a chemical weapons attack by the rebels. So a few weeks later, a few days later, it was the Assad regime using these chemical weapons itself. So this is what happened, and it was especially chlor gas, which is available everywhere, and it sinks down to the cellars, which is very problematic in besieged cities, because people would hide from the bombing and from the air attacks. They would hide in the cellars. The chlor gas sinks down and attacks and gets the people in their shelters. So this is a very, very terrible kind of warfare, and this would be theoretically possible. But I'm not saying that this is going to happen. I'm just alarmed by the kind of propaganda and the disinformation that we are already seeing.
And we are, in fact, seeing claims from Russia, Liana, that the U.S. and Ukrainian governments are operating a secret military biological program, adamantly denied by the U.S. and by NATO. The head of NATO says this could be a pretext for Russian escalation. Would you agree? And under what circumstances could you imagine Putin using either a chemical weapon or even possibly a tactical nuclear weapon?
We have learned in the past that we should be really careful not crossing anything off the list when it comes to what Russia and the Russian President Putin is willing to do. In the case of use of chemical weapons, there will probably not a military reaction, but the sanctions response on Russia would probably extend what we've seen in the past. And Russia knows this very well, and they know that they're already in a difficult economic situation. So in this case, we will probably see full central bank sanctions, oil embargoes, gas embargoes, because this is really something which would overstep a line. When it comes to the nuclear dimension, Moscow has used nuclear signaling to try to deter the West from economic sanctions and from helping Ukraine with weapon deliveries.
So is it a bluff?
I would, in this situation, we've done this in the past, calling what Putin does a bluff. We should not repeat this mistake, but we should sort of evaluate the probability. And of course, any nuclear probability that is a little bit heightened is already a huge reason for concern. But what we've seen is that the United States has reacted with restraint to Russia's announcement, has not raised its own alert levels. And Russia also has a lot of conventional means at its availability before it has to resort to a potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. So we should not cross this out. But at the moment, there are many other means available to Moscow to achieve its war aims, and it's doing this very well.
Let me just ask you to pick up on the point that Kristen made, essentially saying she thinks as long as what happens in Ukraine stays in Ukraine, so to speak, that we would not see an escalation into something that would take us to a NATO-Russia conflict directly. But we have people who know Putin well, like the former head of the Yukos oil company, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who are saying that Putin is a thug, and I quote, with a habit of impunity, who continues to perceive the West as weak and will not stop until confronted with a clear demonstration of strength. How can the West provide such a demonstration of strength in this situation without triggering that conflict between NATO and Russia?
A demonstration of strength towards Ukraine is limited to economic means, and that is what the West is doing. Sanctions in a speed that we've not seen at any point in the past against a power that is so embedded in the global economy. So this is the reaction towards Ukraine, and this is the line. There will be no no-fly zone. There will be no direct military involvement. The US has been very clear on this again and again.
Khodorkovsky would say that's a mistake.
That is an argument that one can make, but and it's incredibly difficult to weight the crimes that are taking place in Ukraine against the threat of nuclear escalation. I mean, it's morally an incredibly difficult choice to take. But NATO is a defense alliance. So what NATO does at the moment is to strengthen its eastern flank, to project exactly that strength that Mr. Khodorkovsky spoke about, and to move from deterrence by posture, these couple of thousands US soldiers there, to an actual presence in the east, to signify to Moscow that this is an actual red line. So NATO's eastern border is the red line that NATO would be willing to use to risk World War III.
We have very little time, but let's return very quickly to the question of whether legal and diplomatic initiatives offer an exit ramp. And no less than 3 international courts are now investigating alleged Russian war crimes and breaches of international law in Ukraine. And one has already ruled. The International Court of Justice in The Hague has ordered Russia to halt its attack immediately. The highest court of the United Nations ruled that Russia is in violation of international law and says it sees no evidence justifying Russia's claim that its military operation is necessary to defend Russian speakers in the Donbas region of Ukraine. But the court has no police or enforcement powers. So will its ruling make a difference? And I'll just ask Louis to please answer that briefly, because I know you have done quite a bit of research on war crimes.
Absolutely. I think with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, what you were talking about, I think it's important to note that they're dealing with states, and where if we could see any kind of prosecution moving forward with regards to international crimes, atrocities, crimes against humanity, war crimes, that would likely be happening with something like the International Criminal Court. And I think it's important to note here
so
that
do their
a lot
rulings,
of the source.
Yeah. Do their rulings actually make a difference for conflict resolution, if not in the short term, at least later on?
Honestly, I'm unsure. I'm not sure it's going to make a difference to Putin, though. I think what we can say, though, is that when we do look at the International Court and the efforts that they're doing, and also some of these other courts in Germany, for example, with universal jurisdiction, I think what we can say, though, is that they are moving forward with this idea that we would gather evidence in order to try perpetrators. And in this case, that could even be someone like President Vladimir Putin.
And Kristen, very briefly, if you would, but if we look at the diplomatic negotiations, whether it's the ones occurring in under the sponsorship of Belarus or Turkey or even EU member states, do you think they can offer an exit ramp that would, in fact, prompt Putin to de-escalate?
Not yet. I think right now Russia is not interested in any negotiation solution, and we have seen the same patterns in Syria. Negotiations keep on going on for years in Geneva, in Astana, wherever. This is happening now because Putin, until now, he has no success in Ukraine that he could sell back at home. So he wants to continue. He wants to create facts on the ground militarily first, and then impose any kind of solution from his mind to the Ukrainian side.
Meaning we will be returning soon to this topic. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us, and thanks to you out there for tuning in.